This lecture is going to discuss the role of women and the expectations that were placed upon women in the late 19th and early 20th century. And not just focused on rural women, although that's kind of overlooking right now, but it's important to remember that a lot of what we're going to talk about was expected of women in cities and towns across the United States during this period, especially if you were in the middle class. So a lot of this pertains to middle class women and also to working class women as well. But focusing for the moment on rural women, what was going on with women who were living on farms and kind of in the middle of nowhere, we have to remember that life for them is pretty rough. Life in general for a lot of these people were rough, but women had it especially rough thanks to the division of labor that was expected on a farm, on a homestead. A woman had to serve multiple roles, and she had expected duties with each role. She had to be a wife, who had to be dutiful to her husband, to serve his needs and comfort him and help him as much as possible. She had to be a mother and be dutiful to her children, to feed them, to nurture them, to clothe them. That was her job. But she also had to be a laborer. She had to work. And labor on the farm took on many different forms. There was domestic labor inside the house, where your job was to maintain the household, to keep things clean, to ensure food was prepared and stored, to keep up with the newest methods of maintaining your household by reading magazines that promoted ideas such as scientific housekeeping, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So you had to be a laborer in the house, but as a farm wife, you had to also be a laborer outside of the house. You're expected to make money for the family. You're expected to help with the agricultural labor, especially for poorer farm families who could not afford field hands. The family itself, the wife and the children, would be field hands when necessary. And as part of that making money and supporting the farm, you also maybe had a second job in terms of like creating clothes and things of that nature to create some money on the side to help the house and the family survive. Now, the idea of a farm wife who not only has to work inside the home, take care of the children, take care of the husband, but also work in the field side by side with her husband does run a little bit counter to a prevailing notion at the time in the U.S. during this period. And that's the notion that certain genders have certain roles. Men have certain roles, and women have certain roles. The idea was that men work outside in the public sphere, where they use their biological superiority to work and to protect women, whereas women use their superiority and their talents domestically to maintain proper homes and good families. This was an idea called the cult of domesticity. This domestic idea, this domestic woman whose entire world revolved around the home. This was a very popular idea in American society and in American popular culture, and it was presented to women through a variety of ways, particularly books and magazines, about how to be the ideal wife and the ideal woman. And the ideal woman meant maintaining the ideal home. And it combines elements of the progressive era at the time, new scientific advancements at the time, all in an effort to give women this certain space and this certain responsibility in a gendered world. The cult of domesticity was essentially a effort in American society to create what they considered to be the ideal female. And the cult itself consisted of 4 different principles. The first was the idea of piety. An ideal woman was religious and loving and willing to self-sacrifice for her family and society. The second ideal was purity. As a woman, your goal was to remain sexually pure as a way to attract a proper man and to keep men's own impure temptations in check. So you were responsible for both your own purity and their purity at the exact same time. The third ideal for the cult of domesticity, the third ideal type of woman, was this idea of submissiveness. Women were expected to be deferential to their men and husbands in all matters, both inside the home and outside the home. And the final cult was domesticity itself, the idea that the woman's world was the household, and performing the duties that went along with it were her realm. One of the main ways in which the cult of domesticity was sort of encouraged and championed was through the popularity of books and journals during this time period. Literacy rates are very high in this country amongst women, and middle-class women and rural women, rural farm women, also all read books. They read these monthly journals and magazines. They read books about popular books on how to keep a proper house. These magazines had articles on how to maintain a proper home. And implicit in all of this advice was the notion that by keeping a clean, neat, and pious home and filling it with these warm, inviting smells like through their cooking, women were achieving their highest calling. So these ideas are being perpetuated in the literature of the time period, especially the popular literature that so many women read. The movement itself, the cult, basically elevated the status of housework to that of being something that women should strive for, to be a housewife, to maintain that perfect home. It's glorified by people such as Catherine Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe, who write a book called American Woman's Home, which is very popular throughout the decades during the 19th century, who really promote this idea of the perfect home, and that a woman's calling is to create the perfect home. And Beecher was an early proponent of the idea of what was called scientific housekeeping. The idea that a good housekeeper, a good housewife, should be kind of this jack of all trades when it comes to sciences, especially the sciences that can be used inside the home to make the household run efficiently. So it was basically trying to turn the idea of a homemaker into a science in order to elevate the status. Now, a key reason why this was so popular, the idea of scientific housekeeping and that women had this special duty within the home, was because a lot of women during this period were well educated. More and more women were going to college during this period, except the problem was that whenever they graduated, while some found work, a lot of women who went to college and earned degrees could not find a job for their degrees. And so their only recourse was to go back home. And yet here they are back home now with all of this knowledge that they want to put to good use. And so the idea of scientific housekeeping, the idea that I can put my studies towards something important, really becomes a popular notion during this period. So the education of women, the college education of women especially, is a prime driver in the idea of scientific housekeeping and really the cult of domesticity to a certain degree. Articles and books on scientific housekeeping were immensely popular during this period. They advised women on the best modern techniques they could use to make running their homes more efficient. For an example, how to effectively design a kitchen that made it easier to cook food for the family, easier and faster, to make it more manageable and modern. And if you look at the slides on our PowerPoint here, you see an outline for a floor plan for a modern kitchen, where things are in a certain order, placed a certain way, in order to make cooking more efficient for the woman. Other elements or the other pages that are also on this same PowerPoint slide show how the idea of scientific housekeeping took organization to another level as well. Things had a proper place, and things were organized in a certain way to make them more efficient and make life easier for a housewife to do her job. Scientific housekeeping promoted medicinal home remedies, things that a woman could use based somewhat on science in order to maintain a healthy household. Ideas on creating healthy recipes and cooking tips so women could feed their families in an efficient and healthy manner. And what it's doing by advertising like this and by promoting these ideas is that these journals and books were really promoting what was a distinctly middle class type of life. And middle class women kind of ate it up. And those who weren't middle class, the working classes, and people who lived in rural areas and didn't have much money, still read these journal articles and these books and, wanted that kind of life. And so even though if they didn't have the financial means, they still strove towards that type of life. And this life was something that wasn't meant to be fancy or extravagant. It was meant to be very kind of no thrills. Everything was meant to be practical. Your furnishings were to be modest. Your rooms were supposed to be equipped with inexpensive, mass-produced technological goods. And everything you had, nothing could be kind of superfluous. It had to have a purpose. All the space had to have a use. All the things had to have a specific purpose. This was the idea of scientific housekeeping, which will be very popular during this period with women in both the middle class and the working class. But the cult of domesticity and the idea of women and what their roles were will extend beyond the household during this period and into the larger community. As women are seen as sort of these caretakers of morality, these defenders of virtue, that message, that idea will go beyond just her family, her children, and her husband, and will encompass the people around her in her city, her town, or her community. She was not just there to protect her family. She was to use her gender, her responsibilities of her gender, to protect and improve the lives of those around her. Many women, especially college-educated middle-class women, would begin to join and form organizations during this period that would allow them to use their role in a public capacity. This is the era of reform in the United States at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, sometimes called the Progressive Era. And many women will become involved in these progressive reforms, a desire to see changes take place to the living conditions of urban environments, working conditions in factories, political issues, in ways that would make the government more responsive to the people. These are some of the ways in which progressives wanted to make change take place, or get change to take place in an ever-changing world during this period. And women will be at the forefront of that through these organizations. For instance, in the rural parts of the country, in the Midwest and the South, many women would join these political movements that were forming during this period that were a protest against the growing power of the industrialists of the North, against the farmers in the Midwest and the South. And women, especially rural women, would join these farmers' groups, these political groups. They were known as the Grange, and more specifically one called the Farmers Alliance, which was a group designed to promote farmers' interests and political candidates who promoted and fought for farmers' interests. And the Farmers Alliance was made up, in many cases, in certain areas and certain communities, if not half, the majority of women in certain groups of the Farmers Alliance. These women took on outstanding political roles within these organizations as leaders, as speech givers. And even though most of them could not vote, at least not at the federal level, they still had an important say in the way the Farmers Alliance, or at least the Farmers Alliance in their own community, moved forward. One of the most well-known of these was a woman named Mary Elizabeth Lease, who was a great speaker, a great orator for the Farmers Alliance. And in one of her speeches, she said her job was to raise less corn and more hell. One of the organization's goals was to, quote, redeem woman from her enslaved condition, that of the housewife or farm wife, and to place her in her proper sphere. Other organizations that had a large number of women members that covered both social and political topics included groups that were really focused on the abolition of alcohol, sometimes called the temperance movement. And one of the more dominant groups during this period that was headed by women was called the Women's Christian Temperance Union Movement, the WCTU. This was a large organization, national organization, again, headed by women, fully by women, who had the stated goal of getting rid of alcoholism and alcohol in this country. They saw drinking as immoral and were driven to protect the family because drinking led to a damaged family. And so here are women using their cult of domesticity role to enact change in this country, social change, in this case getting rid of alcoholism because it was detrimental to the family. And this organization is founded in 1874, and it'll become one of the largest women's groups in the world, or in the country anyway, with about 300,000 members in a short time. And their work and advocacy will eventually lead to the prohibition of alcohol throughout the country with the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1920. But the WCTU, the Christian temperance movement, also had a political platform where women were lobbying for labor reforms and also for the right to have women vote in this country at the federal level. So it's not just a social element here, the idea of women using their domestic role in order to end alcoholism and drinking in this country, but also there's a political aspect of it too, a way to practice politics, to advocate for political power, even in a time period where women had no voting rights. And of course, women joined the women's suffrage movement, creating the National American Woman Suffrage Association, the NAWSA, in 1890, in order to advocate for the right for women to vote at the federal level. In some states, women could vote at the state and local level, but the right to vote for president was still something that was not allowed at the time. Women did not have that right. And so they're going to advocate for that. And their advocacy will help them win that right, the right to vote, women's suffrage, with the passing of the 19th Amendment in August of 1920. So we see with these organizations, the Women's Suffrage Organization, the Temperance Movement, the Farmers Alliance, the female component of the Farmers Alliance, that women, even though they are relegated to certain gender roles and domestic roles, they can use the power that comes with the ideals of the ideal woman, the idea of the protector, the keeper of virtue and all of that. They can use that to their advantage in the public world outside of the home in order to make change take place, positive change, in order to gain more political influence as time goes on.